Reid's mornings were a precisely calibrated ritual of blandness. The clatter of his ceramic mug against the counter, the faint hum of the ancient refrigerator, the rustle of the financial section of the newspaper each sound a testament to a life lived by rote. He worked as an analyst, sifting through columns of figures, seeking patterns in the predictable ebb and flow of markets. His apartment, a modest cube of concrete and glass, offered a distant view of the city's indifferent sprawl, a horizon he rarely truly saw. He was determined, yes, but that determination was often channeled into maintaining the quiet equilibrium of his existence, a defense against the chaotic world outside. He had built a life of careful, measured steps, each day mirroring the last. Then came the call. It was a Tuesday, just as the afternoon light began to soften the edges of his monitor. The phone, a relic of a desk accessory, vibrated with an unfamiliar insistence. A crisp, formal voice introduced himself as the solicitor, his tone clipped and devoid of warmth. He spoke of a distant relative, a great-aunt Reid barely remembered, a name that felt like a whisper from another lifetime. He had, the solicitor stated with a professional detachment that bordered on clinical, passed away suddenly. The news hung in the air, a flat, unexpected pronouncement. Reid felt a flicker of something, not grief, but a peculiar emptiness where recognition should have been. He designated you as his sole beneficiary, Mr. Vance, the solicitor continued, his voice devoid of inflection. Her estate consists primarily of a property. An old cabin. Deep in the Blackwood Forest. Reid's grip tightened on the receiver. Blackwood Forest. The name itself felt like something out of a forgotten fable, a place whispered about, not visited. He remembered fragments of childhood stories, half-heard warnings about that ancient, sprawling woodland, a place where the sun struggled to penetrate the canopy even at midday. It was rumored to be isolated, forgotten, a vast green lung that the modern world had simply bypassed. He agreed to meet the solicitor the following week. The meeting was brief, sterile. The solicitor slid a thick manila folder across the polished desk, its contents detailing the legal transfer of a property so remote it barely registered on modern maps. It's rustic, the solicitor offered, a faint, almost imperceptible curl of his lip. No utilities to speak of. And the roads leading to it are challenging. He paused, then added, there are some local stories, of course. Superstitious nonsense, I assure you. But it might be worth bearing in mind. He didn't elaborate, merely pushed a heavy, tarnished iron key across the desk, its teeth intricate and alien. It was a physical anchor to a past he didn't know, a future he hadn't planned. A cabin in a forgotten forest. It was antithetical to everything he was, everything he had carefully constructed. Yet, a strange, undeniable pull began to form within him, a nascent curiosity that gnawed at the edges of his ordered world. He packed a few essentials, his determination now focused on uncovering the truth behind this unexpected inheritance, this sudden rupture in his placid routine. The drive was long, a slow unraveling of civilization. Cityscapes gave way to sprawling suburbs, then to sleepy towns with peeling paint and forgotten storefronts. The paved roads eventually surrendered to cracked asphalt, then to gravel, and finally, to a deeply rutted dirt track swallowed by an encroaching wall of green. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. He drove for what felt like hours, the track narrowing until the branches scraped against the car's paintwork. A prickle of unease began to crawl up his spine. He felt small, insignificant, an intruder in a realm that predated him by centuries. The stories he'd dismissed as superstitious nonsense echoed faintly in his mind, the solicitor's vague warning now taking on a more ominous hue. Finally, after a particularly sharp bend, the trees receded slightly, revealing a clearing. And there it was. The cabin. The roof sagged in places, covered in a thick pelt of moss. Overgrown vines snaked up its walls, reaching for the eaves like grasping fingers. No smoke, no sign of life. Just the cabin, weathered and ancient, an organic extension of the forest floor. Reid cut the engine. The sudden quiet was absolute, pressing in on his ears, amplifying the rustle of leaves in a faint, unseen breeze. A shiver, unrelated to the temperature, traced a path down his back. The air here felt different, heavier, charged with an unspoken antiquity. He saw no other structures, no sign of human presence for miles. He was utterly, completely alone. He stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under his boots, the sound shockingly loud in the pervasive stillness. The scent of pine needles, damp soil, and something else, something metallic and faintly acrid, like old iron, permeated the air. He walked slowly towards the cabin, his gaze sweeping over the boarded-up windows, the thick, heavy door. Each step felt deliberate, a crossing of an unseen threshold. He could feel the weight of generations, the silent observation of the forest itself. This was not merely an old building, it was a presence. And it was waiting for him. He pushed it into the lock, the mechanism stiff and resistant, groaning as he turned it. The click echoed, unnaturally loud. He pushed the door open, a cloud of dust rising, carrying with it the smell of decay and disuse. He stepped inside, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft, final thud. He was here. And something in the cabin, something in the very air, felt profoundly, terribly wrong. The journey to Blackwood Forest was a descent into a deepening quiet. The paved road gave way to gravel, then to a pair of muddy ruts swallowed by encroaching undergrowth. Sunlight, once a cheerful companion, fractured into hesitant shards as the canopy thickened, the ancient trees interlocking their branches like skeletal fingers. Reid's old pickup truck rumbled, its engine a lone intrusion in the profound stillness that pressed in from all sides. He felt the weight of the forest long before he saw the cabin, a premonition of isolation settling over him. Finally, a break in the trees revealed it, a hulking silhouette of dark timber and moss-laden shingles. The cabin looked less like a home and more like an outgrowth of the forest itself, weathered and stoic, its windows like vacant eyes staring out from beneath heavy brows of eaves. A narrow, overgrown path led to a porch that sagged with age. He cut the engine, and the sudden silence was absolute, a heavy blanket that muffled even his own breathing. A shiver, not entirely from the cool air, traced its way down his spine. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the grimy windows. The interior was a cavern of shadows, filled with forgotten furniture draped in white sheets that billowed slightly with his entry, like ghosts disturbed from slumber. This place wasn't just old, it felt ancient, steeped in a history he couldn't yet grasp. He spent the first few days in a determined effort to reclaim the space. He swept away cobwebs thick as spun sugar, scrubbed the layers of grime from windows, and wrestled heavy, moth-eaten rugs out into the weak sunlight. Each creak of the floorboards, each groan of the settling timber, he dismissed as the natural protests of an old structure rousing from a long sleep. The first disturbance came subtly. He had meticulously stacked a pile of old, leather-bound books on a shelf in the main living area, intending to sort through them later. When he returned from fetching firewood, a single volume lay face down on the wide plank floor, several feet from the shelf. Its spine was cracked, and the pages fanned out like a discarded fan. Reid paused, his brow furrowed. He was certain he'd stacked them neatly. A draft, perhaps? He picked it up, noting its unusual weight, and replaced it, pushing it firmly into the stack. Later that evening, as dusk bled into the cabin through the newly cleaned windows, he heard it, a faint scratching sound from behind the wall near the old stone fireplace. It was rhythmic, like tiny claws dragging across wood, then a pause, then a repeat. He froze, straining his ears. A mouse, he decided, his mind already supplying a rational explanation. The forest was full of critters, and an old cabin was an open invitation. He thumped the wall with his palm. The scratching ceased immediately. He waited, listening, but the only sound was the crackle of the small fire he'd managed to coax to life. Sleep came fitfully. His imagination, he told himself, fueled by the isolation and the unfamiliar surroundings. The next morning, while attempting to clear out a particularly stubborn corner of the small, dusty study, Reid noticed a loose floorboard near an antique writing desk. It wasn't just loose, it seemed to have been deliberately placed, slightly ajar. Curiosity, a stronger force than the growing unease, urged him to investigate. He knelt, prying it up with the blade of a heavy, rusted trowel he'd found in the shed. Beneath it lay a small, lead-lined box. It was heavy, smooth to the touch, and surprisingly cool against his fingertips. He lifted it out, his breath catching in his throat. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age, and a tarnished, intricately carved silver locket. He opened the journal. The script was spidery, almost illegible in places, but the date on the first page was startlingly old, decades before his own birth. As he began to decipher the cramped handwriting, a specific phrase leaped out at him, repeated multiple times in the initial entries, underlined with a frantic intensity: the pact, the lineage, the bunker, the bunker. Reid's eyes darted around the small study, then to the floorboard he'd just lifted. He read on, his heart beginning a slow, heavy thrum against his ribs. The journal spoke of a place beneath the roots of the ancient oak, a place of keeping and sacrifice. It detailed a hidden structure, an underground bunker, built not for protection from external threats, but for something far older, far more insidious. The seed of doubt had taken root, burrowing deep into his resolve. This wasn't just an old house, it was a cage. Reid had spent the first few days in the cabin trying to impose order, as if scrubbing away layers of dust could somehow erase the unsettling silence that clung to every surface. He'd swept, aired out rooms, and even attempted to fix a rattling window pane, all to drown out the gnawing unease that had settled deep in his gut. He told himself it was the isolation, the sheer age of the place, the unsettling circumstances of his relative's demise. But the cabin had other ideas. The first manifestation was subtle, easily dismissed. A faint, earthy scent, like disturbed soil mixed with something metallic and acrid, would waft through the living room when no windows were open, only to vanish moments later. He'd sniffed around, blaming damp wood or the faint odor of old plumbing, but the smell was too specific, too deliberate. Then came the sounds. Not the expected creaks and groans of an ancient structure settling, but something more deliberate. A rhythmic tap-tap-tap from the floorboards above his head when he was downstairs, or a soft, almost imperceptible dragging sound from the attic when he was trying to sleep. He'd lie rigid in the darkness, straining his ears, only for the sound to cease the moment he focused on it. His mind, ever the rationalist, conjured explanations: a branch scraping the roof, rodents in the walls, his own overactive imagination fueled by solitude. One evening, as twilight bled through the grimy panes, painting the cabin in shades of bruised purple, Reid was in the kitchen preparing a meager meal. He'd set his mug of lukewarm tea on the counter, turning to rummage for a can opener. When he turned back, the mug wasn't where he'd left it. It had been moved, shifted perhaps 6 inches to the left, resting precariously close to the edge. He hadn't touched it. He knew he hadn't. A draft? An earthquake? No. The cabin was still. The mug was simply moved. That night, sleep offered no refuge. The cabin seemed to hum around him, a low, resonant thrumming that vibrated through the mattress, through his bones. He pulled the blankets tighter, burying his face in the pillow, but the sound persisted, a deep, pervasive pulse. He felt watched, scrutinized by unseen eyes. His rationalizations crumbled like dry leaves. This wasn't old house noises. This wasn't his imagination. Something was here. Driven by a desperation that bordered on panic, Reid resolved to find answers. He couldn't stay in the cabin without understanding what afflicted it. He pulled out the few documents his relative's estate lawyer had provided: a sparse will, a property deed, and a small, leather-bound journal filled with erratic handwriting. The journal was mostly mundane observations, but interspersed were strange, cryptic entries about the land's demands and the cycle of appeasement. He started with the internet, his laptop a flickering beacon in the encroaching gloom. He searched for Blackwood Forest, for the specific coordinates of the cabin, for his distant relative's name. The initial results were sparse, mostly historical logging records and vague mentions of the area's early settlement. Then he stumbled upon a digitized archive of local newspaper clippings from the early 20th century. One article, yellowed and faded, detailed a series of unexplained disappearances in the Blackwood region, dating back generations. No bodies, no clues, just people vanishing into the woods. The language was flowery, almost superstitious, hinting at ancient curses and the forest's hungry maw. He found another article, a brief notice from the 1950s, mentioning the construction of a peculiar, reinforced structure on a remote parcel of land, a private project undertaken by a reclusive landowner. Reid's fingers trembled as he zoomed in on the grainy image accompanying the article. A crude, hand-drawn map was visible in the corner, showing the general vicinity. A small, almost imperceptible X marked the spot of the bunker, and to his horror, it was disturbingly close to where the cabin now stood. He compared it to the property deed he held. The land parcel was unmistakably the same. His relative had inherited a property with an underground bunker on it. Why had no one mentioned this? What was its true purpose? He pored over the relative's journal again, the cryptic entries now taking on a sinister weight. The key to the bunker, one entry read, is held by the protector. Another, the bunker must be sealed. The offerings must continue. Offerings? The thrumming from beneath the floorboards seemed to intensify, a low, guttural growl that resonated with the words he was reading. He was no longer just dealing with a strange old house, he was uncovering a history, a secret buried deep, literally, beneath his feet. The air in the cabin grew thick, heavy with unspoken truths and the promise of ancient horrors stirring from a long, troubled slumber. The ancient trees interlocked their gnarled branches, forming a ceiling that bled the light from the sky. Reid's old truck groaned over the last stretch of muddy ruts, the engine finally sputtering into a tired silence. Before him, nestled deep within the gloom, stood the cabin. It was smaller than he'd pictured, hunched and sagging, as if the weight of the forest had pressed down on it for centuries. Its windows, dark and vacant, stared out like empty eyes. He stepped out, the damp earth squelching under his boots. This place felt less like a home and more like a tomb. Reid pushed aside a curtain of ivy that clung to the cabin's porch, finding the front door warped and swollen with moisture. It opened with a groan that seemed to echo the cabin's age. Inside, the air was stagnant, heavy with the smell of dust and disuse. Cobwebs draped every surface, shimmering faintly in the meager light filtering through grimy windows. Nothing here hinted at the life of the distant relative he'd barely known, only a profound sense of abandonment. He spent the first hour methodically searching, his determination warring with a growing sense of unease. He checked under the cot, behind the hearth, even prodded at the loose floorboards he found near the kitchen. There were no hidden compartments, no cryptic notes, no obvious clues to the cabin's secrets. Frustrated, Reid stepped back outside. He needed a clearer head. He walked a slow perimeter around the cabin, his eyes scanning the dense undergrowth for anything out of place. The forest pressed in tightly, its ancient trees forming an almost impenetrable wall. He noticed a slight depression in the earth about 50 yards behind the cabin, partially obscured by a thicket of blackberry bushes. It wasn't natural. The ground sloped too evenly, and a faint, rectangular outline hinted at something beneath. Pushing through the thorny bushes, Reid found a trapdoor, almost perfectly camouflaged by moss and layers of decaying leaves. It was made of thick, weathered timber, banded with rusted iron. He knelt, scraping away the debris, and found a heavy, corroded latch. With a grunt, he forced it open. It was an entrance to something subterranean. An underground bunker. He retrieved a powerful flashlight from his truck. Its beam cut through the absolute blackness as he peered down. A set of crudely constructed wooden steps, slick with moisture, descended into the gloom. He hesitated, a prickle of genuine fear blossoming in his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, to turn back to the truck and drive away from this forgotten place. But his determination, a stubborn current beneath the fear, pulled him forward. He had to know. One step, then another. The wood creaked under his weight, the sound amplified in the confined space. The flashlight beam danced over rough-hewn earth walls, shored up in places with rotting timber. The descent was steep, winding deeper than he'd anticipated. He could feel the weight of the earth above him, a crushing presence. At the bottom, the bunker opened into a small, square chamber. The air here was utterly still, devoid of even the faintest draft. The walls were lined with rough shelves, mostly empty, but in one corner, a small, sturdy wooden chest sat on the damp floor. It was unlocked. Reid's hands trembled slightly as he lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a single, leather-bound journal. Its pages were brittle and yellowed, filled with cramped, spidery handwriting that looked centuries old. He pulled it out, his fingers tracing the faint, faded symbols etched into the cover, not letters, but something more primitive, like intertwined branches or distorted human figures. He flipped it open, the pages crackling. The journal wasn't a diary in the conventional sense. It was a chronicle, a meticulous record of strange occurrences and even stranger beliefs. His ancestor, the original builder of the cabin, had not simply settled on this land. He had made a bargain. A desperate pact to protect his lineage from a blight, a famine that had swept through their previous settlement. The price? A sacrifice. A ritualistic offering to the deep earth, to the ancient guardian of the forest. Not just a one-time thing, but a recurring obligation, a tithe of life to maintain the pact. A life for a life, a soul for the soil. The blood of the lineage nourishes the root, and the root protects the tree. He read further, his mind reeling. The guardian, the entity, was not some outside force. It was intrinsically tied to the very soil beneath the cabin, to the ancient burial ground rumored to exist there. It had been slumbering, protected by the pact, but now, with the passing of the last relative and the interruption of the offerings, it was stirring. The journal described the rituals in agonizing detail, the specific phases of the moon, the preparation of the offering, the symbols to be carved into the earth. It was horrifying, a descent into a forgotten, barbaric world. And then, a final entry, dated only a few decades ago, in a different, more contemporary hand, it stirs. The neglect has angered it. The pact will demand its due, and more. We are all bound. The blood calls. Reid slowly closed the journal, its weight suddenly immense in his hands. He wasn't just an inheritor of a cabin, he was an inheritor of a damnation. A horrifying lineage of sacrifice. The entity wasn't just in the cabin, it was the land. And it was awake. Reid slowly closed the journal, its weight suddenly immense in his hands. The sounds of the forest above, once distant, now seemed to press down, a chorus of whispers at the edge of his hearing, but here, in the damp stone chamber, they were replaced by a profound, suffocating silence. He stood, unmoving, the cold seeping into his bones. It happened again, then a third time, each flicker longer than the last, until the light was a frantic pulse, mirroring the erratic beat in his chest. A low, resonant hum began to vibrate through the stone floor, rising from deep beneath the earth. It wasn't a mechanical sound, it felt organic, like the sustained note of an immense, buried organ. He clutched the journal tighter, its old leather cover slick with the sudden dampness on his palms. He couldn't discern words, only a sibilant, overlapping murmur, like dry leaves skittering across stone, yet laced with an undeniable malice. He spun, trying to pinpoint the source, but the sound shifted, always just out of his direct perception, seeming to come from behind him, then beside him, then directly into his ears. He stumbled backwards, knocking against a rough-hewn shelf laden with forgotten tools. His breath hitched, a desperate gasp for air that felt thin and insufficient. He needed to get out. Turning sharply, he lunged for the heavy wooden door of the bunker, the one he'd pried open with such effort only hours ago. He fumbled for the latch, his fingers numb, his mind screaming at him to hurry. The metal was frigid under his touch, refusing to yield. He twisted, pulled, pushed, but the latch remained stubbornly fixed. He pulled harder, his shoulder aching as he threw his weight against the wood. It didn't budge. It was as if the door had been sealed shut from the inside, or perhaps, from the outside. A faint, sickly green glow began to emanate from the cracks in the stone walls, tracing faint, spiderweb patterns across the rough surfaces. He heard his name, twisted and drawn out, spoken by multiple unseen mouths. Reid. He pressed his back against the unyielding door, his eyes scanning the bunker frantically. The light bulb above flickered, then died, plunging him into absolute blackness. He was no longer just hearing them, he felt their presence, a multitude of unseen eyes fixed on him. Then, he felt it. He scrambled forward, blindly, his hands outstretched, desperate for anything solid, anything familiar. He grasped it, pulling it close. It was a small, intricately carved wooden effigy, no larger than his palm, depicting a grotesque, elongated figure with wide, vacant eyes and outstretched, claw-like hands. He recognized the style, the disturbing symmetry, from the crude drawings in the journal. It was one of them. He saw a clearing, bathed in the pale light of a forgotten moon. Figures in cloaks moved silently, their faces obscured by deep hoods. They stood around a freshly dug pit, and in their hands, they held similar wooden carvings. The vision was fleeting, a half-second of pure horror, but the message was clear: sacrifice. This wasn't just about a pact, it was about blood. His blood. His lineage. You are mine. Reid dropped the effigy as if it had burned him, the wood clattering on the stone floor. He stumbled backwards, tripping over something unseen, falling heavily. The impact rattled his teeth, but he barely registered the pain. It was here, tangible, demanding. He scrambled to his feet, his mind racing, a primal scream caught in his throat. The cabin, the forest, the very ground beneath him, it was all a trap, a living maw that had finally decided to close. Escape was not an option, survival was the only prayer. The effigy, a crude twist of gnarled wood and knotted twine, lay inert on the stone floor, a silent accusation. Reid stared at it, his chest heaving, the icy grip of the entity's presence still a tangible weight in the air. It had been here, a cold breath against his neck, a whisper that wasn't sound but understanding. The realization that the cabin was no longer merely a place of unsettling phenomena but an active, malicious prison, jolted him upright. He couldn't stay. He wouldn't. A surge of raw, desperate determination coursed through him, overriding the paralyzing fear. Survival. That was the only thought that mattered. He snatched his backpack from the floor, his fingers fumbling with the buckles. A can of preserved fruit, a half-eaten energy bar, a small multi-tool, pathetic provisions for an escape, but it was all he had. As he moved towards the door, a sharp crack echoed from the floorboards above, directly over his head, as if something heavy had just dropped. He froze, listening. Nothing. He yanked the cabin door open, the old wood groaning in protest, and burst out into the twilight, gulping down the cool, pine-scented air. It was a momentary reprieve. The forest, a dense wall of ancient firs and skeletal birches, loomed, its branches interwoven like a protective cage. He plunged into it, pushing through the undergrowth, ignoring the stinging scrapes on his forearms, the way the damp earth squelched beneath his boots. He ran, driven by a primal urge to flee, to put as much distance between himself and the malevolent presence in the cabin as possible. The path, once faintly discernible, dissolved into a tangle of roots and fallen leaves. He spun around repeatedly, his breath ragged, convinced he heard something behind him, a low guttural hum that vibrated in his bones. Disorientation set in quickly. The compass on his phone was useless, spinning wildly, its digital needle refusing to settle. He pushed himself up, mud clinging to his palms, his mind racing. This wasn't natural. The forest wasn't just dense, it was actively confusing him, guiding him in circles, playing with his perception. He heard a child's faint, high-pitched cry, echoing through the trees, then the mournful howl of a wolf, too close, too human. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the encroaching madness. Just as despair threatened to consume him, his foot snagged on something metallic and unseen. He pitched forward again, sprawling onto a patch of coarse, brittle grass. A single, heavy padlock, corroded green with age, secured it. An underground bunker. A flicker of hope ignited within him. A shelter. A place to regroup, to hide. Maybe even a way out, a forgotten passage. He attacked the padlock with the multi-tool, his fingers clumsy with urgency, the tiny saw blade scraping uselessly against the thick metal. He dropped it, frustration boiling over. He looked around wildly, desperate. His eyes landed on a heavy, jagged rock half embedded in the earth. He seized it, his muscles screaming in protest, and brought it down with a desperate, guttural shout, smashing it against the padlock again and again. Metal shrieked, sparks flew, and with a final, resounding crunch, the padlock shattered, its broken pieces scattering across the ground. He heaved the heavy hatch open. A gust of stale, earthy air, thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood, rose from the depths. It felt wrong. But the thought of returning to the cabin, or remaining lost in the conspiring forest, was worse. He pulled out his phone, its flashlight beam a weak but vital spear against the gloom. The beam of his light cut through the inky blackness, revealing a narrow corridor that stretched into the unknown. The bunker was larger than he'd anticipated. He moved through it, his boots scuffing against the gritty floor, his breath fogging. In the frigid air. He passed empty storage shelves, rusted metal cabinets, and then, a room. His flashlight beam swept across the far wall, illuminating a series of crude, intricate carvings etched directly into the concrete. They weren't symbols of protection or warding, they were depictions. Figures, gaunt and stylized, bound with ropes, their heads bowed, their forms intertwined with serpentine shapes and geometric patterns that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. And beneath them, etched deeper, almost gouged into the concrete, were names. A list. Family names. His own lineage and dates. A horrifying chronology of offerings, stretching back generations. Each date corresponded with a period of sudden, inexplicable prosperity for the family, followed by a mysterious disappearance or death. The Pact. It wasn't a vague legend. It was a terrifying, concrete ledger, carved in stone. He wasn't just trapped, he was the next entry. His escape had led him deeper into the maw. He was cornered, his mind teetering on the precipice of utter madness, the walls of the underground bunker closing in, not physically, but spiritually, sealing his fate. Reid stood in the cabin's main room, the effigy a silent, accusing presence on the rough stone floor. His breath still hitched, a ragged sound in the suffocating silence. The cold had receded, but its memory clung to his skin like damp grave clothes. He hadn't imagined it. Deeper. The cabin was a cage, but it was also a map. The forest, not back towards the Fate Road, but further in, where the trees grew thicker, their branches knitting a canopy so dense it devoured the sky. He moved with a strange, almost trance-like resolve, his steps heavy on the damp earth. The forest floor became uneven, roots like grasping fingers beneath the leaf litter. He pushed through tangled undergrowth, thorns snagging at his clothes, until the trees suddenly thinned into a small, unnatural clearing. In the center, partially swallowed by moss and a tangle of thorny vines, was a low, squat mound of earth and rough-hewn stones. A faint, almost imperceptible seam ran along one side, barely visible beneath the creeping flora. A door. Not a door to a house, but a portal into the earth itself. The underground bunker. The air here was still, dead. No birds sang. No breeze stirred the leaves. It felt like the forest held its breath. With a grunt, he strained against the heavy slab, dislodging ancient earth and protesting roots. He stepped inside, the stone slab falling back into place with a sickening thud, sealing him within. The passage was narrow, sloping downwards. The walls were rough-hewn rock, slick with condensation, their surfaces textured like ancient, petrified skin. Water dripped somewhere, a maddening, irregular rhythm in the suffocating quiet. He moved slowly, his boots crunching on loose gravel, each sound amplified, swallowed, then returned to him as a phantom echo. The air grew heavy, tasting of dust and grave. The passage opened into a larger chamber, a cavernous space carved deep beneath the earth. They were covered in carvings. Not simple pictographs, but intricate, disturbing reliefs that told a story in stone. Reid raised the lantern higher, his hand trembling. The carvings depicted generations of figures, gaunt and solemn, offering up what appeared to be their own life force, or perhaps the lives of others, to a central, amorphous symbol. It was not an animal, nor a human form, but a swirling vortex of lines and angles, emanating tendrils that seemed to grasp at the supplicants. Below these scenes, smaller, almost indecipherable script snaked across the stone, a language he didn't recognize, yet felt he almost understood. We keep. We are owed. He recoiled, stumbling back from the wall, his heart hammering against his ribs. The entity was here, more powerfully than ever before. It wasn't just a presence, it was a consuming force, radiating an ancient, ravenous hunger. His gaze fell back to the altar. Strewn across its surface were brittle, yellowed fragments of parchment, preserved by the bunker's dry, cold air. He snatched them up, his fingers clumsy with fear. The script was archaic, but some words, names, were familiar. His own. His ancestors. The words swam before his eyes, coalescing into a horrifying truth. Generations ago, an ancestor, a chieftain or patriarch, had sought to protect his people, his land, from some encroaching blight or famine. He had made a bargain with it, the swirling symbol, the entity of this place. Protection, prosperity, fertility of the land, in exchange for a tribute of life, a periodic sacrifice from the bloodline itself. Not just blood, but life force, vitality, consciousness, willingly offered, or taken. The entity wasn't just a malevolent spirit, it was a primal, ancient hunger, a guardian corrupted by its own power, or perhaps, always a predator cloaked in protection. It had anchored itself to the land, to the family, through the pact, feeding on their essence, growing stronger with each passing generation. The lineage falters. The sacrifice wasn't just to appease it, it was for it. To sustain it. To allow it to persist. And the final, horrifying realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. The entity wasn't just claiming the cabin, it was claiming him. His relative's sudden death wasn't mysterious, it was the entity collecting on a past due payment, an appetizer before the main course. To defeat it. How could one defeat an entity woven into the very fabric of the land, an entity sustained by his own bloodline for centuries? A final, absolute severance that would leave nothing behind, for anyone. The malevolent hunger was not just in the cabin, but in his very bones. The entity was his blood. The realization coiled around Reid's heart, a viper striking deep. It wasn't just in the cabin, it was in him, a dormant seed waiting for the right conditions to bloom into full, consuming power. Panic threatened to unravel him, but a stubborn ember of defiance flickered. He wouldn't be another link in the chain. He wouldn't be its next meal. He remembered the cryptic passage he'd found tucked inside a hollowed-out book, a faded diagram pointing to a symbol etched into the cabin's hearthstone. Below the fire, where the earth listens. There, the heart of the pact beats. With a desperate surge of resolve, Reid wrenched a heavy iron poker from its stand. The hearthstone felt cold, almost slick, beneath his fingers. He traced the symbol, a tangled knot of lines resembling a gnarled root system. He pushed, heaved, and then, with a groaning scrape, a section of the stone shifted inward, revealing a gap. It was a passage, not a natural crack, but a deliberately concealed opening. This was it. The heart. The place where the pact had been forged in, he prayed, could be broken. Clutching the lantern, its beam a meager defiance against the overwhelming gloom, Reid descended. Each rung was slick with moisture, tasting of mineral and decay. He could hear a low, rhythmic thrumming, like a vast, slow heartbeat resonating through the stone. It vibrated in his bones, a deep, resonant hum that felt both primal and profoundly unnatural. The latter ended abruptly on a narrow ledge. The space was an underground bunker, not a natural cave, but a deliberate construction of rough-hewn stone blocks, perfectly fitted, forming a circular chamber. The ceiling was low, the air thick and stagnant, heavy with untold years of confinement. Around it, carved into the very walls of the bunker, were the same writhing symbols he'd seen in the cabin, but here they pulsed with a faint, sickly green luminescence, like veins beneath thin skin. It was a chorus of voices, ancient and young, male and female, all intertwined, all hungry. Reid tightened his grip on the lantern, his knuckles white. It was a palpable entity of pure malice, an ancient, insatiable hunger given form by the very space it inhabited. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the small, tarnished silver locket he'd found hidden in a loose floorboard of the cabin. It was his great-grandmother's, according to the faint inscription. Inside, a brittle, faded lock of hair, presumably his own ancestors'. This, he had concluded, was the key. The pact was sealed with blood, sustained by lineage. He needed to sever that connection, symbolically and spiritually. "You cannot break what is already bound," the collective voice hissed, growing louder, more piercing. "You are ours." He took a deep, shuddering breath, focusing on the locket, on the brittle hair within. He had found a counter-ritual, a fragment of an old family legend that spoke of severing the ties of an unwanted inheritance. It involved a symbolic sacrifice of the familial link, a rejection of the bond. He placed the locket on the altar, its silver-tarnished surface reflecting the sickly green light. He then pulled out a small, crudely fashioned obsidian blade, a relic he'd discovered wrapped in linen beneath the cabin's foundation. "No!" The bunker pulsed, the very stone seeming to flex. Reid's hand trembled, but he forced himself to focus. He held the obsidian blade over the locket, its tip glinting faintly in the eerie light. He imagined the vast, unseen tendrils of the entity, reaching out, trying to reclaim him, to pull his back into the cycle of sacrifice. He closed his eyes, picturing the ancient pact, the bloodline, the burden. And then, with a guttural cry of defiance, he brought the obsidian blade down. Not on himself, but on the locket, on the symbol of his inherited connection. He struck the silver, not to destroy it, but to mark it, to break the symbolic seal. The screams subsided into a low, guttural snarl, a promise of retribution. Reid stood there, panting, the obsidian blade still clutched in his hand. He had struck a blow, yes, but the entity was far from vanquished. He had merely awakened its full, terrifying wrath. The bunker, though quiet now, still hummed with an ancient, patient malevolence, waiting. Reid woke to the taste of copper and dust. His head throbbed, a dull, relentless drumbeat behind his eyes. He lay sprawled on a cold, rough floor, the chill seeping through his clothes and into his bones. His breath hitched, a ragged rasp that echoed too loudly in the suffocating silence. Every joint ached, every fiber of his being felt wrung out, like a wet cloth twisted dry. He remembered little beyond the blinding flash, the searing pain that had ripped through his arm as he'd plunged the ritual dagger into the heart of the locket, the brittle hair within dissolving into a puff of foul smoke. He remembered the guttural shriek that had followed, a sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the air, then nothing. His left forearm burned. He peeled back the tattered sleeve of his shirt, wincing as the fabric stuck to dried blood. Beneath, a jagged, angry red scar marred his skin, a crude, star-shaped brand that pulsed with a faint, icy heat. It wasn't merely a wound, it felt embedded, a permanent mark of the exchange. He ran a trembling hand over his face. His skin felt clammy, his hair matted with sweat. The psychological toll was already immense. A profound emptiness gnawed at him, a feeling that something essential had been ripped away. Not just his peace, or his sanity, but a deeper, more intrinsic part of his being. Even fear, while present, was muted, a dull ache rather than a screaming panic. The bunker itself was a claustrophobic box of damp concrete, lit only by the weak, flickering beam of his half-dead flashlight, which he found lying nearby. The air pressed in on him, heavy and unmoving. The entity's rage, the cabin twisting around him, the air thick with despair and ancient malice. He'd barely made it out, barely managed to complete the final, desperate act here, in this forgotten hole in the ground. Did it work? The question clawed at him, a raw, insistent worry. It was an absence, not a peace. He had to know. The trapdoor above creaked open with a groan that seemed to echo the weariness in his own bones. The cabin stood before him, silent. It was different. The swirling distortions around its edges were gone. But it wasn't peaceful. It wasn't welcoming. It stood stark and still, a skeletal silhouette against the emerging light. The wood, once seeming to writhe with ancient malice, now looked merely old, decaying, forgotten. There was nothing. Only the chirping of unseen insects, the rustle of leaves in a faint breeze. The cabin was empty. The entity was gone. A wave of dizzying relief washed over him, so potent it almost buckled his knees. He had survived. He had done it. The silence wasn't a silence of peace, but of waiting. The cabin felt like a stage after a performance, the actors gone, the props removed, but the echoes of the drama still clinging to the air, invisible but palpable. He scanned the forest edge, the ancient trees standing like silent sentinels. He had banished the entity from this place, severed his connection to its lineage of suffering. But the legends had been clear: such things were never truly destroyed. They merely shifted. They moved on. The ritual had been about severing his ties, not eradicating the entity. It had been a desperate act of self-preservation, a cutting of the thread that bound him to the horror. But the horror itself, the ancient pact, the malevolence that transcended time, that still existed. He had merely closed a door for himself, not for the world. The entity was free, unburdened by its connection to his family, free to find a new vessel, a new place, a new lineage to haunt. It was the crushing burden of this knowledge. He had saved himself, yes, but he had unleashed it, unmoored it, set it adrift. The horror wasn't gone, it had simply changed its address. And Reid, forever marked by its touch, was now cursed with the terrible, certain knowledge of its continued existence, a lonely sentinel in a world oblivious to the monster he had helped set free. The cabin was quiet, but the world outside now felt deafeningly loud with implied threats. Reid woke to the taste of copper and dust. The air was thick with the metallic tang of old blood and something else, something acrid and burnt, clinging to his tongue. He coughed, a dry, rasping sound that echoed in the oppressive silence. The floor beneath him was concrete, unyielding, and stained with patches of rust-colored residue. He was in the underground bunker. He had done it. He had severed the connection, at least for now. The pact was broken, the lineage of sacrifice, he hoped, finally ended with him. But the cost. The cost was etched into his very being. There were tools scattered on a workbench in one corner, rusted shovels, a pickaxe, coils of thick, rough rope. Remnants of his desperate preparations. He remembered digging, remembered the frantic need to seal away what he'd found, to bury the truth deeper than any earth could hold. The door, a heavy slab of reinforced steel, stood ajar, a sliver of gray light teasing from beyond. He stumbled towards it, his balance off, his body a symphony of aches. Each step was a testament to survival, a defiance against the oblivion that had threatened to consume him. He pushed the door open fully, revealing a narrow, dirt-floored passage that sloped upwards. The air here was cooler, fresher, carrying the faint, earthy scent of damp soil and decaying leaves. He ascended slowly, his gaze fixed on the growing patch of daylight above. When he finally emerged, blinking into the muted afternoon sun, the forest canopy greeted him with a solemn hush. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. He looked back at the bunker's entrance, a crude opening in the hillside, almost swallowed by the encroaching foliage. It looked like a wound in the earth, barely healed. The cabin stood a short distance away, silhouetted against the pale sky. It looked different now, not physically, but spiritually. He approached it cautiously, every nerve alert, half expecting a new horror to spring from its windows. He pushed open the front door. The interior was still, the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light that pierced the grimy windows. The air was stale but clean, devoid of the sickly sweet decay that had once permeated every plank and beam. He walked through the rooms, a ghost in his own inheritance. He saw the marks of his struggle, the overturned chairs, the scattered papers, but the malevolence, the twisting of reality, was gone. He packed a single bag, essentials only. He didn't want anything that held the cabin's lingering scent, its memory. He left the few remaining family photographs, the tattered journals, the ancient map. They were part of the story, but not his story anymore. Not in that way. He had wrestled with the past, and for now, he had won. Stepping out, he locked the door behind him, the click echoing with a strange finality. He didn't look back as he walked to his vehicle. As he drove away, the cabin shrinking in his rearview mirror, a profound weariness settled over him. He was free. The entity, the pact, the sacrifices, they were behind him. He had faced the horror and emerged. He had seen too much, understood too much. The world no longer held the same simple veneer. The horror hadn't consumed him, not entirely, but it had carved a space within him, a permanent scar that pulsed with a quiet, unsettling awareness. And now that he did, he would never be able to unsee them.